Welcome to our Beer U presentation on the brewing process and overview. In this presentation, we plan to highlight and describe each part of a typical brewing process from beginning to end. We'll cover the highlights and leave most of the details to other modules. If you're looking for a quick overview of how beer is made, you've come to the right place. The brewing process consists of many steps. Each step involves converting the raw ingredients of barley, hops, yeast, and water into a delicious beverage. Along the way, there are many physical, chemical, and biological changes in the ingredients that need to happen to brew beer. There's a great deal of science to the process, and we'll touch on some of it, but we aren't going to get too detailed with it in this module. For now, let's start with the very beginning of beer making. Malt is often called the heart of beer for good reason. Malted barley, or malt, is the basic ingredient used in the production of beer, providing complex carbohydrates and sugars necessary for fermentation, as well as contributing flavors and colors that are uniquely characteristic to beer. In the malting process, barley is steeped in water, which begins a process called germination. During germination, the barley begins to grow from a seed into a plant. During this process, proteins and carbohydrates in the barley break down, making starches inside the barley available for the brewing process. After germination reaches the desired point, and before the growth process uses up all the valuable starches in the grain, it is stopped in the drying process inside a kiln at around 180 degrees. Kilning normally lasts for a few hours, but some specialty malts are created by kilning for longer periods of time or at higher temperatures. Malting is normally done before the grain gets to the brewery. Specialized professionals known as maltsters usually do this work in facilities dedicated to the process. Once the grain has been malted, it is delivered to the brewery, but it's not ready for the brewing process just yet. It must be milled by the brewer before it can be used. Milling is typically done in a grain mill, where large rollers smash incoming grain between them. Space is left between the rollers to allow for just the right amount of crushing. The milling process exposes the inner starches and sugars, allowing better access to it during the brewing process. The husk of the grain is kept with the rest of it because even though it doesn't provide much for the finished beer, it is important in the brewing process, particularly during the upcoming lautering phase, where the empty husks will act as a filter bed. Mashing is the process of combining a mix of milled grain, known as the grist, with water and heating up this mixture. In some ways, it's kind of like steeping tea. Mashing is really a continuation of a cooking process that started with malting and which will continue later in the boil process. Mashing starts the conversion of starches from the malt into sugars, which will later provide fuel for the yeast to create beer. Mashing removes most of the proteins, starches, and sugars from the grain, leaving behind what is known as spent grain. The liquid that started this process as hot water, and sometimes is called hot liquor, is now full of sugars and other elements from the grain. This liquid is now called wort. Mashing is normally done in a vessel called the mash tun. Lautering is the process of separating the liquid wort from the spent grain. It is sometimes done in a separate vessel called a lauter tun, although some brewers do the lautering in the mash tun, the same vessel that the mashing was already done in. To begin the lauter process, brewers allow the steeped water, now called wort, to drain from the bottom of the vessel through a slotted or false bottom, leaving the spent grain inside the vessel while the wort moves on to the boil kettle. After much of the wort has drained, warm water is sprayed onto the remaining grain in a process called sparging. Sparging removes even more solids from the grain that the mashing process might have left behind. During lautering, the grain is occasionally raked to make sure that the wort has plenty of opportunity to drain properly, getting all the good stuff out of the grain and ready for the rest of the brewing process. Once the wort has been lautered, it is moved to a boil kettle. There it will be brought to a boil for 1 to 2 hours depending on the beer, and a number of good things will happen to the wort in this process. First, boiling sterilizes the wort by killing any bacteria or microorganisms that might be in it. Second, boiling removes undesired volatile elements from the wort, such as contaminants in the water. Third, boiling concentrates the wort as some water evaporates during the boil. Brewers normally plan on this in their recipes and count on it happening. Fourth, Unwanted solids are removed from the wort during part of the boil called the hot break. The hot break happens when the solid particles in the wort clump together in big enough chunks that they literally just drop to the bottom of the boil kettle. Lastly, and very importantly, flavoring hops are added during the boil. In the boil process, a key flavor component of the hops called alpha acids become water-soluble in a process known as isomerization. Once this happens, the wort is able to retain some of the flavor characteristics of the hops that would otherwise be lost. After the boil, there are still plenty of solid particles in the wort, like small pieces of hops. Putting the wort through a whirlpool helps to remove many of these particles. In a whirlpool, solid materials tend to clump together in the center of the vortex while the liquids are forced to the outside of the vessel. When the wort is drained, the solids are left in the vessel. The solid matter that clumps together in this process is known as trub and is composed of hop fragments and proteins. A phenomenon known as the tea leaf paradox forces the solid material to gather in the center of the whirlpool, and it settles to the bottom of the tank in a cone-like shape as the liquid is drained off. In larger breweries, the whirlpool is often a separate piece of equipment, while in some breweries, the whirlpool is built into the boil kettle itself. After the boil and whirlpool are complete, the wort, still hot from the boil, must be brought down to a temperature that won't kill the yeast that will soon be added to begin the fermentation process. That means getting the boil temperature wort down to 70 degrees Fahrenheit or below. This can be accomplished quickly with a heat exchanger or wort cooler. Speed is essential in this process, particularly in a home brewing setting, because during the cooling process, the beer could be exposed to airborne bacteria or other potential infection sources that could find the sugary, sweet wort to be a very attractive source of food. A good heat exchanger or wort cooler can accomplish this in a matter of a few minutes. After the wort has cooled, yeast is added to it to begin the fermentation process. Putting the yeast into the wort is called pitching. During fermentation, yeast consume the sugars in the wort. They then excrete carbon dioxide, or CO2, and alcohol. CO2 is what carbonates beer, and alcohol does, well, you know what alcohol does. Fermentation can happen in as little as a few days for some ales, while lager fermentation can take up to a couple of weeks. Once the yeast have produced CO2 and alcohol, the wort can then be called beer. Most beers aren't ready to drink immediately after fermentation, so they're left in a vessel to mature and condition for a while. Sometimes this happens in the fermentation tank, but sometimes the beer is transferred to a different vessel for this process. Transferring to a different vessel is called racking. During maturation, additional chemical and biological processes are at work that eventually lead to the final taste and character of the beer. The yeast can continue its activity, some solids can settle out of the beer, and other chemical actions can help create the final beer. Maturation can happen for some ales in as little as a few days, while some lagers may take many weeks to mature. Some English-style ales undergo a process known as cask conditioning. In a cask, beer matures for a while and is eventually served directly from the same vessel or cask in which both fermentation and maturation have taken place. In some cases, particularly with Belgian-style beers, maturation continues to occur even after the beer is bottled, when yeast is added to the bottled beer to begin a process known as bottle conditioning. For those beers, the character of the beer can continue to refine itself even over a period of many years. Now that we're near the end of the brewing process, the beer still contains some solid particles composed of yeast, proteins, and bits of hops or malt grains. In most cases, brewers prefer to remove those solids completely, so filtration is now needed. A typical filtering method passes the beer through a series of plates, each one containing smaller and smaller holes that trap the solid particles from the beer, but which allow the beer itself to pass through. These plates are usually coated with a powdery material called filter media. Filter media helps to trap most of the solid particles while allowing the liquid to pass through. Filtering has the benefit of stabilizing the beer by removing the solid particles that could eventually ruin it. Filtering also brightens the beer by making it very clear and brilliant in the light. Although many beers benefit from some solids remaining in it, many people seem to prefer crystal clear beer. Other beer drinkers appreciate the character and flavor that some remaining solids can provide, and some beers are packaged and served unfiltered. Packaging is putting the beer into the containers in which it will leave the brewery. Typically, this means bottles, aluminum cans, and kegs. Beer packages are typically designed to protect the beer from elements that could harm it. Ultraviolet light, for example, can quickly turn a great beer into a bad one. Packages like kegs and cans keep light out entirely, while brown-colored bottles do a very good job of keeping the bad light out. Ultimately, the package is designed for both enjoyment and convenience of the consumer, wherever they might be drinking beer. The last step in the brewing process is getting the beer to you, the beer consumer. In some cases, consumers can visit a brewery tasting room and drink fresh beer right where it's brewed. But more often than not, people will drink beer in bars, restaurants, sporting arenas, or perhaps they just want to drink a beer at home. That's where distributors come into the picture. As of 2013, there are well over 2,000 breweries in the United States and hundreds of thousands of locations that sell beer. Distributors make this process more efficient because it's impossible for every brewery to make their own deliveries to every beer retail location. Beer distributors also pay state taxes on beer and provide variety to consumers by bringing dozens of different brands to stores. Beer distributors also provide and manage a complex logistics system that helps keep beer fresh while transporting beer from the brewery to the store. Congratulations! You've finished the module. Hopefully you have a few minutes to take the optional quiz that is coming up. Like I said, it's optional, but if you are taking a Beer U curriculum and need to get credit for this module, you'll have to take the quiz and get at least 70% of the answers correct in order to show this module is complete. Good luck!